So we're going to start the first unit. We'll do a bit of this on actually making selection decisions. Today, the basic learning objectives will be to differentiate what we'll call screening from selection. We'll debate the pros and cons of several widely used screening tools, particularly applications, and biographical info blanks, reference and background checks, and resumes, video resumes. We'll know something about talk about the legal status of screening tools and their validity, and we'll discuss designing a multi-stage screening platform. The basic concepts here are screening in general terms. This is going to be our first phase of selection, where a rough cut, so to speak, of the larger applicable pool is taken out. So this is what's sometimes referred to as a weed out process, right? So we have whatever our initial big pool of applicants are, and we're trying to kick out the ones who we are not interested in looking at further. And so this is a place where the minimum qualifications, which we mentioned before, come into play. So this is, the knowledge, skills, and abilities or experience that are deemed necessary for being at all capable of doing the job. So like I said, this is something this will come up again when we talk about base rates a little bit later, minimally acceptable performance, right? So it doesn't mean you're going to, these are not qualifications that say you're going to do well at the job, just to say if you lack them, you cannot perform the job to a minimum standard. So this is sometimes called this is a first cut, and it's sometimes this is probably inappropriate, it's called selection criteria. Because as we'll deal with later on, selection is really something else. Screening is getting people out of the applicant pool, and selection is getting people from the applicant pool into the organizations. So the big thing is candidates who do not receive or who do not have the minimum qualifications are not going to get considered any further, right? They're just gone. So this is the case where, although we'll discuss the legality of it, this is the case where it's just like, if you don't have the right degree, you're out. If you don't have a minimum GPA meeting, you're out. Something along those lines. Basic concept. We need to realize that there are designated targeted groups. These are what we would call, these are generally protected classes. So we have women, visible minorities, Aboriginal peoples, and persons with disabilities. So in general, well, we'll discuss that in further. These are federally designated in Employment Equity Act to receive legal protection in employment policies. So minimum qualifications can critically affect the status, and that might lead to adverse impact, right? So we've got to be somewhat careful here. Now, I'm going to introduce, this is a term that we've thrown around a little bit, so we can have you already have a bit of an idea, but let's be very and now that we're going to start talking about screening and selection, we have to be really, really, really cognizant of what we mean by validity. So we're going to define the terms that are necessary to discuss the validity of a selection system. So first is going to be the validity coefficient itself, which is going to be some measure of the relationship between whatever our predictor. So our screening criterion, our selection criterion, whatever we're using, the minimum qualifications, whatever it is that we're talking about, the relationship, an index of the relationship of that with the outcome of interest, which is usually job performance in some setting, or in some sense. Like that could be, when we're talking about job performance, that might be supervisory ratings of job performance we talked about with in performance appraisal. It could be, measured like in a relatively objective measure, like a production output, billable hours, sales, things like that. Any of those might work. That's going to be our typical outcome. We could use something else, but in the kind of applied setting that we work with here, I mean, some measure of performance is almost certainly what we're going to use. The only other sorts of things that would come up are sometimes retention, like if we're concerned about hiring people who don't stick around, that does come up with some stressful jobs. Like for instance, there have been cases, particularly in the United States, where there have been maximum caps on the cognitive ability screening that they often, or cognitive ability tests that are often used there, because they find that cops who are quote unquote too smart don't stick around in the job for very long. So weird things like that can happen. Another case is um, adverse impact itself can be a criterion, although that's usually a little bit more complicated, and we wouldn't just measure it as like the correlation of the predictor with the outcome, but it can be part of sort of an optimal setting where we're like, we want the best prediction performance we can get with, like, we want to balance this so that we have a maximum, like the best predictive ability for a given, no more than a given level of adverse impact. Something along those lines. That's more complicated and kind of beyond the scope of this class, but it is a possibility. Now, the other thing is the selection ratio, which is the proportion of applicants that are actually selected into positions. So the basic idea, let's say we have 10 positions and 100 applicants. If we actually fill all 10 positions from that, we have a 10% selection ratio. The base rate, this one's a little bit more of a slippery concept, but it's related back to that idea of minimally acceptable performance that I talked about with the idea of minimum qualifications. The base rate is the proportion of individuals in the population, so the population that we're trying to reach through recruitment, so people who would be interested in applying for this job. So the population that can perform the job at least a minimally proficient level. So let's say like maybe 50% of people could do a given job at our minimum level of acceptable performance. That means the base rate is 50%. If it's a really hard job, maybe 8%. Well, let's just pick a rounder number, like a 10% of the population can do it. A really easy job, maybe 85% of the population can do it at minimally acceptable levels. Sorry, the alarm that one of my alarms was just going off. So how do we deal with this? Like when we're trying to quantify validity, what we're trying to get at is correct versus incorrect decisions. So there are two kinds of correct decisions and two kinds of incorrect decisions. They're based on whether we choose to hire the person or not. Right? So when we're hiring, we make a correct decision when we select someone who performs acceptably well, and when we choose not to select someone who would not do well, acceptably well, if we hired them. And when hiring, we make an incorrect selection when we select someone who does not perform acceptably well, and I probably should say or, when we fail to hire someone who would. And so you can kind of group this into into um, so kind of group this into four categories. So this is So these are the kinds of decisions. So we have performance being good or bad and selection yes or no. So it's a correct decision when we have someone who has good performance and we select them. And it's also a correct decision when we say no to someone who would have bad performance, right? And similarly, we have incorrect decisions when we say yes to someone who has bad performance and no to someone who has good performance. Notably, generally, now there are some ways around this, but typically we only get access to this data, right? We only see the actual performance of the people that we hire, and that will be important. Now, So here's another illustration of it with blue line. The horizontal blue line here is indexing minimally acceptable performance. So above that blue line, these are people who are doing the job adequately, like not necessarily well, but adequately. And as you go up, the performance improves. So the higher you are along this line, the better performance is. But that's just saying, like, if you're at or above this line, your performance is minimally acceptable. If you're below that line, your performance is unacceptably poor, right? So if you like below that line, just not good enough. Similarly here, we've got our, the vertical line here represents the selection cutoff, which is like our minimum selection test score. Like you have to be above that threshold to get selected. So if you're on this side of the line, we select you, and if you're on this side of the line, we don't select you. So that means that all the people that we actually have data on, that we actually observe their performance under typical circumstances, are up here, right? They're over here. And so the people in this quadrant, this upper right quadrant here, they are people we hired and have acceptable performance, and people down here have unacceptably poor performance. And the people over here we don't actually see. Right? Now the other things to be clear about here, just try to take a moment here. The oval is just a stylized representation of the correlation. So this is sort of like a scatter. This is just a stylized version of a scatter plot. So the idea here is there is inside this, there is a regression line, make it like that, closer to the or to that dot right there. I'm just having trouble drawing it with my mouse. That there's a regression line in here, and this is just sort of representing the spread around that regression line. So the basic idea here is, you know, if we had a perfectly reliable selection system, it would go exactly through the middle, and we wouldn't hire anybody who was below our selection test score. So we wouldn't make, if it was perfectly reliable, there would be no one in this quadrant. Everyone that we hired would be in this quadrant. So the basic idea is the more valid our selection, whatever our screening or selection tools are, the smaller this chunk is, the less we have in here, because these are the poor decisions that most directly impact our bottom line. These are the people who are not giving us a good return on our investment in terms of hiring them. Whereas people up here are doing the minimum. And then the higher the person is on this, the better their performance is, the better return we're getting on selecting them. So here's another way of labeling it, and this corresponds with the quadrants exactly to the way to this, just a different way of representing it, and representing it on sort of like this sort of more quasi-physical model of what the selection system or screening system is doing. So here we have one version of a correct decision. So these are people who are above the performance standard, right? And who scored well enough to get hired. So they're a correct decision. We accepted them. We made the offer to them and they came joined us. This is also a correct decision. This is someone down here. This is a rejection. This is someone who did not score above the threshold on our selection test, and they would have been lousy performers otherwise. And over here, we've got a false positive, right? So this is someone who scored, this is someone who quote unquote tests well, right? So they did well on, you know, whatever our screening or selection measure was, but they're not a good performer. Their performance is below our minimally acceptable standard. And over here, we also have another false incorrect decision, which is a false negative. We have someone who, this is someone who tests poorly on the other hand, right? So they came in and whatever selection or screening criteria were, they didn't do well enough on it. But had we hired them, they would have performed above the threshold. So they're essentially like I mean, as you can see, they're the mirror image of this. Like they did poor. These people over here did well on the test and poorly on the job. These people did poorly on the test, but would do well on the job if we just had hired them anyway. But because they didn't do well enough on the test, we didn't hire them. And again, that's something, another thing to remember here. Wait, it's hard to erase things. There we go. Folks over here, well, in this whole half of the graph, these are people that in general, because they didn't score well enough on the selection test measure here, we don't hire them. Now, there are ways of designing validation systems, which we'll talk about, I think next week or maybe in two weeks, that you can get information on these folks, but it does involve a significant cost of introducing a selection system but not using it to make decisions yet. And that probably doesn't make any sense. And that's because it is kind of crazy from a practical standpoint. It's not something that organizations typically do. Like if they put in a new selection system, they want to start using it to make decisions pretty much right away. So like I said, we'll talk about that in terms of validation designs later. So here's an example of kind of like putting together, this is a flow chart or a decision tree for a basic screening approach. So the first question is, do we have like if we have an opening or more than one, right? And so the first question is, are there applicants, which is the recruitment question, right? And if the answer is no, then we have to intensify our search. We need people to actually apply for the job, and this could lead to, I mean, we could be change our advertising for the job, send out emails to listservs, advertise in trade publications, hire a search firm, whatever, depending on what the job is. So if we have no applicants, we're not going to hire anybody, so we need them. So we would so the solution there is to intensify search. If we do have applicants, we need to ask the question, do the applicants meet the minimum requirements? This is a screening question. And if the answer is no, we reject them, right? So this is, remember, screening is just saying, like, should we look at you further? If the answer is yes, they go on. If the answer is no, they're just out, right? So you can think of this as a hurdle. Next week we'll talk about, what's sometimes called a multiple hurdle selection model, and this is a hurdle. It's something you have to get over to get to the next step. So in some kind of races, you have to jump over the hurdle to get to the next part of the race. And if you don't make it over the hurdle, you're out, right? But if they do meet the minimum, if the applicants do meet the minimum requirements, which is again not going to be all of them, right? Some of them we're going to reject. Perhaps it could be all of them, right? Maybe we did a really good job of advertising this, so no one applied who wasn't minimally qualified. Great. Anyway, so they meet the minimum requirements. So we move on to, which applicants are the most qualified? So minimum requirements maps to screening, which is a select out process. Looking for the most qualified applicants, this is selection, and that is a select in, right? So although it leads to the same thing, anybody who isn't at or near the top of the list gets rejected, right? And the ones who are most qualified, we at least make a hiring offer to. And this is something that, again, we'll deal with later on in the course, but to remember that chances are most people, or at least a lot of the times when people are applying for one job, they're applying for multiple jobs, and the person who is the top of your list is likely to be at the top, at or near the top of your competitors' lists or other business, or even not competitors, other organizations' list. So even like they may not be applying for jobs in all the same industries, so they may not lose this person to a competitor, but the people who are at the top of your list are probably going to be are likely to be the best candidates overall. And so if you make an offer to when you make an offer to your top applicant, there's a good chance that they may have competing offers from other organizations. And the better they are, the more likely they are going to be to have competing offers. So it's just something to bear in mind because it's something that can affect the return, right? And this goes back to some of those ideas that we talked about when we talked about recruitment, that how do you make your organization appealing to your top candidates? How do you increase the chance that if you make an offer to them, they're going to say yes? But again, the rest of that's a story for another time. I just want to warn people that that idea is coming. Now with screening methods, there are a lot of methods. So like probably the simplest one, probably what, lots of you have dealt with, especially for when you're dealing with relatively unskilled jobs or large employers like retail and those sorts of things. Application blanks are quite common. So, this is a form completed by the job candidate that provides the prospective employer with basic information about their knowledge, skills, and abilities, their education history, and their previous work experience. Now, the important thing is you cannot ask for prohibited or discriminatory information in the application unless you can demonstrate that it is a bona fide occupational requirement, or as I sometimes might say, bona fide occupational qualification. Remember, requirement is the Canadian term, qualification is the US term. Obviously, I learned it in the US, so sometimes I'll slip. But so B4, that's a bona fide occupational requirement. So in this case, you on your application, it is not legal to ask for someone's social insurance number, their date of birth, their sex, their marital status, the number of dependents, the name of their next of kin, or their health status. You can collect that information, but only after hiring. And under some circumstances, that hiring can mean hiring does not necessarily mean actually beginning employment for that person, particularly for jobs that require things like background checks and security clearances. Some high stress occupations, you make a conditional offer. So the offer is, we will hire you conditional on you then passing the security check or something along those lines. For like jobs that deal with sensitive information, classified information. So for instance, this is something you'll occasionally see with jobs that require a security clearance. If you don't already have one, then you would get a conditional offer, conditional on passing the necessary background checks to get a security clearance. This is why government contractors and government agencies often, like if you already have a security clearance for whatever purpose, you might be hired for a job just because it's less costly than doing the investigation. Weighted application blanks are just a different form where the information provided on the application is formally scored. So we assign weights that reflect the value of each item to the prediction process. So for example, 80% of dispatchers, so dispatchers, like people who are dispatching ambulances or police cars or something along those lines, with high school graduation, have good attendance. The remaining 20% have poor attendance. So that's 80% minus 20% equals 60. That provides the basis for the net weight being a high school graduate, right? So the fact of the matter is, people who are high school graduates do a better job of showing up for that job than not. So, but not a perfect job. So the differential between them provides. So we might give that something proportional to 60 percentage points there. This can be effective for reasons that we'll talk about at the end, towards the end of class. But they typically are built around, like, each scoring bit is built around a narrow aspect of performance. And to develop you're scoring, you tend to need a lot of data, which means you need a large number of employees to develop that. So this is not something, this is not an approach that is going to work, at least not developed in-house by even most medium-sized enterprises, right? And if you're a small business, this is just, this is just beyond you, at least do it in anything formal. Um, so, and it's also always not always clear why it works. Like people who graduate, like it's not necessarily, there's not necessarily a clear link between something like this, like high school graduation and attendance on the job, right? I mean, I can spin a story about it that probably involves something like conscientiousness, but there's also biographical information blanks, which are similar in some ways to applications, but they're not built the way applications are. And so there's a questionnaire that provides detailed job-related background, but that, because it's so detailed, that can raise privacy concerns. But we're looking at things like school achievement, higher education achievement. It can involve like trying to assess things like drive or ambition, right? Like if you did a lot, if you did things like extracurriculars or you held leadership positions, as the next one shows, that indications of sort of character, drive, ambition, those sorts of things, financial responsibility, and situational stability. This is these are especially appropriate for when you're going to be making a very large number of hiring decisions. So if like you're in, this is probably um, ridiculous if you were trying to fill one or two positions, but if you are, if you're something like a call center where you're constantly trying to, like where staff is turning over regularly, then maybe this is a good idea. Or something like a large retail operation where you make many hiring decisions, like you might make, as an organization, might make multiple hiring decisions a week, then this can be a good option. And probably the most common thing here is resumes. So again, this is another, resumes are typically a more informal, well, I shouldn't say informally, but um, less structured, like whereas, so like the biographical information stuff, that's a questionnaire that's structured by you. Resumes are structured by the candidates, right? So the applicant decides what they're going to tell you. So, well, I mean, I guess the applicant decides what they're going to tell you in the biographical information blanks, but you decide what you're going to ask about, right? Whereas with resumes, the applicant is deciding what they are going to tell you. And in general, they're going to list concrete experiences and accomplishments, and that's going to, like, to the extent that it does that, as opposed to just saying, I worked here. Then like actually saying, I worked at this organization, I held this position, I worked on these projects, and these are the things that I learned and accomplished. Then that helps the whoever the HR person or hiring manager that's reviewing your application helps them evaluate it. So that's a good piece of advice. The more concrete you can be about the experiences you had at a job, usually the better. Recruiters seem somewhat able to infer extroversion from the structure and information contained in resumes, but not much else in terms of like the specific individual differences that we talked about over the past several weeks. So they, resumes give a clue to that, to extroversion, but not much else. And in general, resumes should, like, you want to, when you're sending out a resume, you want to accompany it with a well-written cover letter. So the book has some pretty good, has some pretty, well, a very concrete section about writing resumes in general. The one thing to know about cover letters is write it for the organization that you're sending it to, right? Don't have a fully generic cover letter. Tailor it. Explain tell them about what's interesting about that organization to you, why you would like to work there. I mean, a lot of people wind up making their cover letter just an extended introduction to their resume, which kind of is there. And I mean, you want to make yourself look good in it, but you also want to communicate, like that's your opportunity to communicate what you like about the organization that you're applying to, what intrigues you, and that can help you to stand out. It helps lock you into the person evaluating your resume's mind. Now, on the other side, just from the standpoint of the HR person or hiring manager who's actually screening the resume, you need to really think about what your organization needs in terms of its job performance criteria, and you want to, when you're reading the resume, you don't want to be thinking in abstract or in general about the quality of the candidate. You want to be thinking about what those job performance criteria are and what the resume is telling you about how well the person would do with reference to those criteria. So you need to be thinking, like, if you're looking for a sales job, you want to be really thinking about what the experience, somebody may have like something that you think is a really cool experience, but it's an experience that has relatively little to do with sales. In which case, just because it's cool and exciting, you probably want to downweight that. You want to check the resumes for work experience, specifically the chronology and history. Something that really does tend to trigger red flags is if there are unexplained gaps. Like, gaps in a resume are fine. People have had illnesses, maybe they have to take time off to care for a sick family member. Maybe they temporarily left the workforce because they had children. There could maybe they immigrated and were unable to work for a short period of time after immigration, or for a period of time after immigration. So I mean, there are often good reasons why there are gaps in somebody's employment history. But when those gaps are unexplained, that can be troubling, because it could reflect, especially if there's lots of gaps, that could reflect something that is literally called in the literature hobo syndrome. So people work long enough to get the money for the kind of lifestyle that they enjoy, then they quit, they roam around until they're broke again, and then get another job to make money to the extent that they can do what they want, and then go away. So that's like, if you want to hire someone for the duration, that's not good. It could also indicate possibly mental health challenges or problems with criminality or drug use or something along those lines. So unexplained gaps can have really sound explanations that are just perfectly fine, and other ones that may be red flags for your organization. Like, that could be an indication that this is someone who you want to be cautious in hiring. There are and conflicting details, right? That could be an indication. It could be just that, somebody's trying to write. Maybe it's the first resume that they put together for a while, and so they're writing just from their memory and are confused about when specific things happened to them. Or it could be an indication that they are in fact embellishing or lying about their work experience. So those are things to look out for. And this kind of goes back to the second point, which is you're examining the resume for concrete accomplishments and identifiable skills, right? You want to be able to, after reviewing the resume, you want to, if you think that person is a good fit for the job that you want to be able to explain why. You don't want to just say, like, I got a good feeling about this person. You want to say because they have experience with Excel, they accomplished a project of a similar scale to what we want from them, something along those lines. You want to be able to have like pretty concrete reasons for recommending the person. And resumes are not incredibly valid. Like when we score resumes for experience, there's a predictive validity. So the validity coefficient is about 0.18. Academic achievement has a correlation with performance of 0.11. Education has, so academic achievement, that's going to be both degrees and GPA. Education is just usually scored just as years of education or something along those lines, 0.1. So again, these are not great. So actual work experience, is starting to get you on par with something like some of the better, more predicted personality characteristics. So they're not in terms of thinking about these in terms of how valid they are at predicting performance, resumes are not incredibly useful. They are useful, like they convey actual information, but not a ton of it. But that's the same thing as, I mean, find any kind of even semi-professional job that is not going to ask you for a resume. This is pretty much the resumes are pretty much a standard part of the selection process, regardless of whether they're informative or not. And then another idea is reference checks. So this is information that you're going to gather from past or current supervisors, coworkers, clients, or others. Now, typically references are nominated by the candidate. So, you may list references as part of your resume. An application blank may ask for it. It may be asked for on a biographical information blank, or after you may ask for people, like you may just ask for an application or a resume, potentially both, and only after people have been screened, then you'll ask for references from them. Often, like I'd say, probably 2 to 5 references are most common, and yeah, I mean, it can be lots of different things, like especially for like if you're looking for relatively experienced workers, yeah, supervisors, coworkers, clients are very, very common. But it could be sometimes, especially for entry-level jobs, the references might be what are sometimes called character references. So, like if you're hiring someone who's never worked before, they're not going to have a supervisor. To talk to you, but maybe they have a neighbor that they've helped take care of their lawn for years, or a teacher, a mentor of some kind, like a coach or scout leader or something ridiculous. Sorry, I shouldn't say something ridiculous, but something like that. And so usually these are going to be references are going to be checked using letters of recommendation. So the reference will write a letter, and this is something that's happened. I had a number of calls about former PhD students of mine, where they wanted to check even if we wrote a letter, they wanted to just call and talk to you for 10, 15 minutes. Something to, and that's the thing, is employers pretty frequently do contact references even when they've been given letters, and this is usually near the end of hiring. One thing that is really important here is you don't ask about protected information. So the same things I listed before that you can't ask on applications or biographical information blanks, you cannot ask the references either. So you're not asking them about their sex, their race, their religion, their age, those sorts of things. You're not asking that stuff here. What you're asking is purely work related, reference related information. So typically that's going to be about a person's work history, but if you're talking to a coach or a teacher, you're going to be talking about like how well they take supervision, how well they take feedback, how well they perform, those sorts of things. So you're still keeping it to the kinds of knowledge, skills, and abilities that are relevant to the position that that person had. So if that was work, great. It's really easy to keep that work related. If it's something from school or sports, it may be about that position, but you're asking about things that should be indicative of how that person, like how conscientious that person is, diligent, receptive to feedback, those sorts of things that are work relevant. And reference calls, these are the kinds of questions that you typically want to be asking. So like ask how long you knew the person, the applicant, and in what capacity. So that's the kind of things like how long have you known, I'm just going to use the name Min because that's one of the students that I've answered these questions for. But no one here knows that. No one knows that. That's not even the person's real name. So how long? And I would respond to that. I've known Min for 8 years. He was a PhD student of mine, and such forth. What sort of employee was the applicant? Well, like I said, he was a PhD student, so he was a research assistant and a teacher. What does the applicant show initiative? Yeah, he came in with thesis data that on day one he wanted to turn into a publication. He sought out challenging roles in teaching and in research, and he took non-required classes that were technically challenging. So does the applicant get along well with others? Absolutely. Frequently would bring in baked goods, was an active participant in discussions, and was helpful to another student who was going through a difficult personal time. And does the applicant meet deadlines? Yes. In fact, he always tries to set early deadlines so that we are sure to be done in time to make any kind of changes that we want to do ahead of deadlines. So that's the kind of thing. And one thing to keep in mind here, sometimes employers have a policy to only verify information that the applicant has provided. So you're not going to ask anything follow-up. You're just going to verify that the applicant has given their true name. They have given the correct or an honest name and description of the position, and how long tenured they were with that position or the organization. And that just is a way of avoiding providing false, misleading, or accurately negative information about current and former employers. And so that's what I'm saying is when I say employers here, I'm not talking about when you're like the potential employer making the call. I just realized that wasn't clear. Talking about like as an employer, if someone looking to hire one of your current or former employees calls you or contacts you, these are the only things that you're willing to say, and that's just that way you can't accidentally provide false information, you can't mislead them, and you are not making any negative comments about the employee, even if it's true. So that's a perfectly reasonable policy to have, and if you were if you were contacted and you worked for an organization that had that policy, deviating from it, that is a fireable offense. Negligent hiring. So you can be held accountable if the employee harms others and reference checks were inadequate. So you want to train your staff, like whether these are your HR staff or you have managers who are doing their own hiring or any of those things. You want to train the staff, and you want to have a hiring and reference policy. Right? You want to have something that's written down that you can point to and say, we have a policy, and employees who do this, who do reference checks are trained on the policy. You can require applicants to sign reference check authorization for consideration, consider signed release for former employers, right? So you say that way you have that. So if the former employer is reticent to provide any information at all, you have this signed declaration that it's okay for you to check the references. You conduct your checks in accordance with appropriate legislation, which is here mostly being clear that you are not asking about anything protected, and that in general all reference questions are job related. And then actually check them, right? Don't just make requests. You have to follow, like if you make a request and you don't get a follow up and you don't get a response to that request, call again, send more emails, because again, like some organizations are not going to be responsive. So you gotta follow up. And in general, especially if you're, well, references are pretty useless. Like it's a thing. Like I said, this is a thing from a legal standpoint. Yes, because of this negligent hiring concept here, you want to do your reference checks, but this is sort of more of a at this point more of a legal thing rather than a selection thing. Now, occasionally, I'm not going to say reference checks are always and everywhere useless. Like reference checks can be an important part. I mean, they are actually important in things like doing security clearances and like security background checks for things like, well, for sensitive jobs like police officer, some military positions, things like that. Like I'm not saying that they are unimportant, but in terms of predicting performance, they're pretty useless. For one thing, in general, people are going, I mean, since they're nominating their own, like if you think your boss is going to give you a bad reference, you're probably not going to nominate that boss. And people often, because they don't want their current employer to know that they're applying for jobs, they will not list their current employers who have the most current information about them. Maybe they're looking for a new job because they're having a hard time at work and they don't want you to know about that. So there's all kinds of reasons why. But basically, the main thing is, since people nominate their own references, they're going to nominate people who they're typically nominating people who are going to say nice things about them. And so the basic idea here is there's not a lot of variance in the quality of references. And this is why sometimes, like I've had students who I've had for like one semester who have asked for letters of reference, and I'll do that. I'll say I will do that for them. But in general, it's also usually I do that with the caveat. It's like, hey, I don't know you very well. You know, you took one class with me, you did fine, but that's all I can say is that you came to class, you did a good job in it, and that's not a very good, I mean, that's a perfectly fine reference, but it's not a good reference. So usually I say, is there somebody who knows your work? Is there another teacher who knows your work better? That can say more about why you're a good student, can say something personal about you that might be compelling to a potential employer. So, like if I don't know a student very well, I'm perfectly willing to write them an adequate letter of recommendation. But an adequate letter is actually a bad letter because that's just what it is. I mean, I had so this is one time, interestingly enough, I had a situation where when I was a senior PhD student, I had a junior PhD student ask me to write a letter of reference for him for some purpose, and I was like, I don't have that much to say. And I strongly encouraged them to ask somebody else. But he's like, no, I want you to do it. And I was like, man, the best thing I can do is say that you're punctual. And like that's damning with faint praise, right? Which is because most letters of reference are glowing, a reference letter that's just like, yep, this guy shows up on time. That's all I got to say. Looks pretty bad in comparison. So these are just things to think about with letters of reference. background checks. Again, similar to, um, in fact, essentially identical to reference checking, but are more likely to involve sensitive information. These are typical for high level jobs like, executive or senior management positions, government jobs, and any job related to security. Like for instance, two of my former roommates wound up working for defense contractors in the United States, and so because I had been their roommate for I'd known them for years, and I was there. In one case, I had been the guy's roommate for multiple years. The FBI the men in the dark suits showed up to ask questions about them as part of the background check because they needed a security clearance, even for an engineering job for a defense contractor. So those are the kinds of things that go on there. And yeah, for positions like that, yeah, it's going to be, um, the FBI, the Secret Service, or some other Justice Department agency in the United States who's going to be doing that kind of work. Uh, Now, on that note, actually, I think you know what selection ratios and base rates. I think it might be a better idea to save that for next week. That's going to go really well with the stuff we talk about. So we'll revisit that. We'll come back to it, or we'll come back to that next time. All right. Thanks. Have a good day. Talk to you later.